If you grew up in a religious American household like me, chances are your relationship with Halloween was a little bit complicated. It was that one holiday that existed in a kind of gray area. For some, it was just good, clean fun, carving pumpkins, trick or treating as a family, and the occasional small group get together that stressed nonviolent, fun costumes that were a mix of popular TV characters from the day. My coming of age in the 80s and 90s, these would have been G.I. Joe, He-Man, She-Ra, the Care Bears, as well as the more traditional, yet still sanitized, spooky attire like Count Dracula or some nondescript witch and so on. But for others, Halloween was a sinful, shameful celebration of unmitigated hedonistic evil at worst, and frivolous secular consumerism at best. Regardless, it was to be avoided and disavowed by any and all upstanding Christian peoples. And in the post-woke pendulum swing of trad life values, I see the latter belief in Halloween's malignancy growing. You hear how celebrations are more demonic than ever, more promiscuous, more calling evil good and good evil, putting darkness for light and light for darkness, putting bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter, to reference Isaiah 5:20. But having come of age so long ago, I can attest to the ever-present nature of more risque costumes, underdressed nurses of loose moral character, twisted haunted houses with chainsaws, blood, and gore way back when, as much as it is today, some 30 years later. Yes, you had to seek it out a bit more, but it's always been there. I think it only seems more prevalent because social media and global connectivity do amplify the ills of everything in a fallen world. Not only at a louder volume, so to speak, but also by orders of magnitude. The fringe under a magnifying glass is distorted to appear much larger than it is. And from here, I do think one of two things can happen. First, it can simply create a kind of feedback loop referred to as the false consensus effect, where people overestimate how widely their views are shared, or pluralistic ignorance, where individuals go along with the perceived majority view, even if it doesn't reflect their own beliefs. This is also known as the Abilene paradox, wherein a group collectively decides on a course of action that none of the individuals truly want, only because each person mistakenly believes that's what everyone else is thinking and therefore wanting. The concept originated from a story about a family trip to Abilene, Texas, where no one in the family actually wanted to go, but everyone agreed because they thought it was what all the others wanted. This paradox illustrates how pluralistic ignorance can lead to collective decisions that don't reflect individual preferences, often due to a misperceived consensus. However, I think the second possibility is that the amplified perceived consensus reinforces fringe views, and because algorithms often prioritize popular content, which again can initially misrepresent reality, the feedback loop created ultimately does in fact change that reality via the promotion of the fringe, until it actually becomes mainstream, or at least really seems so. So in light of this, what is the believer to do? Abandon Halloween once and for all? Or can it be reclaimed? But if it's retreat, I ask, where does it stop? Were the Puritans right? Dress in black and white, for colors tempt the vile delights of the soul? Eschew all earthly things. Halloween is but a fallen celebration of sinful nature and death, and always has been? Or are there aspects about Halloween which the believer can reclaim? In search of the answer I posit, we have to look back at the history of Halloween and see the context and traditions from which it emerges. As Shakespeare famously asked, "What's in a name?" And of course, for the follower of Christ, the answer is everything. Which is why every year in December, you often hear people say, "Put the Christ back in Christmas." Well, I ask, why not put the hallowed back in Halloween? The name Halloween comes from the phrase All Hallows Eve, which refers to the evening before All Hallows Day, also known as All Saints' Day, November 1st. In the 8th century, Pope Gregory III designated November 1st as All Saints' Day, or All Hallows' Day, to honor all saints, known and unknown. This day is followed by All Souls' Day on November 2nd as a day to pray for all faithful departed souls. These are observed in Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Lutheranism, Anglicanism, and Methodism. On All Souls' Day, people pray for the departed, visit cemeteries, decorate graves, and eat special foods and pastries. Catholics believe that on All Souls' Day, the faithful on earth can help the souls in purgatory through prayer, sacrifices, and masses. This will, of course, sound familiar with the Mexican celebration Día de Muertos, Day of the Dead. This spans November 1st for children and infants through November 2nd for adults who have passed away. Families create altars, or ofrendas, adorned with photos, marigold flower petals, and favorite foods of the deceased. Cities like Oaxaca, Michoacan, and Mexico City are especially famous for their elaborate celebrations, parades, candlelit ofrendas, decorations, and cemetery vigils. In Guatemala, a similar celebration occurs on November 1st, known as Día de Todos los Santos, All Saints' Day, including unique traditions where massive, colorful kites are flown to honor the dead and symbolize communication with spirits. Peru celebrates Día de los Difuntos, Day of the Deceased, on November 1st and 2nd by visiting cemeteries, bringing flowers, and preparing traditional foods to honor their loved ones in a more somber fashion. Similar unique celebrations occur in Ecuador, Bolivia, Brazil, and the Philippines, and beyond. China and Japan throughout the year have similar celebrations in which they honor, reflect, and remember the dead. But returning to our consideration of the pair of days, All Saints and All Souls days, we see how Halloween turns this pair into a trio, creating what was originally known as Allhallowtide, where the term hallow comes from the Old English word meaning holy. Easton's Bible Dictionary says it means to render sacred or to consecrate, coming from the Saxon to make holy, as we see with the name of God in Matthew 6:9, the Lord's Prayer. Rendered in the King James, "Therefore pray ye, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." And All Hallows Eve was eventually shortened to Halloween, with "een" being a contraction for Eve. As for the holiday itself, its roots go back to ancient Celtic celebrations, particularly Samhain or Cowin, where the SOW of the word rhymes with cow, the pronunciation coming from the Irish Gaelic, which doesn't follow English's phonetic rules. The Celtic festival marked the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter. It was during this celebration that the Celts believed the boundary between the living and the dead thinned, allowing spirits to roam the earth. So people would light bonfires and wear costumes to ward off spirits. Pope Gregory III's attempt to Christianize the holiday in the 700s with his designation of a day to honor saints, martyrs, and all souls shows the early church's desire to integrate and transform pagan symbols and customs into Christian celebrations and iconography. The Celtic cross is a good example of this, blending the cross with the sun. And so, with All Hallows Eve over the centuries, characteristics from both Christian and folk traditions, like souling and guising, became popular in medieval Europe. In this practice, people would go door to door offering prayers for the dead in exchange for soul cakes, or they would dress in costumes as a way to honor the saints and avoid spirits, same as with Samhain. In the 1800s, European immigrants, especially Irish Catholics, brought these traditions to North America, where All Hallows Eve eventually became Halloween. Eventually, any and all hallowedness disappeared in mostly Protestant America, and the holiday became a more secular celebration focused on candy, costumes for the sake of costumes, and trick-or-treating because of said candy. The roots were cut, and without any anchor to its enchanted religious past, Halloween has evolved into an honorific celebration of death, blood, and gore, as well as dehumanizing people via sexual objectification, the adoration of demons, and last but not least, the Protestant discarding of the rest of Allhallowtide. Now you might be thinking, good, on that last part, if you aren't Catholic, which I myself am not. But even my having been raised a fundamental evangelical, I still took part in day one of what is truly a 3-day celebration. And yet, by skipping the holy days, even if only observed in their acknowledgement as the 2-part end of a 3-part story, I was robbed of the metaphysical richness and symbolism of that whole story. And so what I was left with was an incomplete story, a partial story that only told of death, nothing of a resurrection. But we are in need of the whole story, which is why Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 15, "Do not be uninformed, brothers and sisters, concerning those who are asleep, who have passed away, so that you will not grieve like the rest who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, in the same way, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. For we say this to you by a word from the Lord. We who are still alive at the Lord's coming will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the archangel's voice, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are still alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore, encourage one another with these words." But what does any of that have to do with Halloween, you might ask? And why should Catholic holy days play any part in a non-Catholic life? Which I only stress because I believe if you are Catholic, you already more than understand. Yes, Halloween's traditions did evolve from a mix of ancient Celtic beliefs, which Christians later modified, adapted, and spread across Europe, as well as later into North America. And yes, today's Halloween is far removed from the 2 days that come after it. But in modernity's Nietzschean post-God, for he is dead, world, today's Halloween is removed from even its pre-Christian spirituality, which, although clearly not biblical, was still quite different from what has replaced it. Pagan though they were, Celtic celebrations on Samhain were never nihilistic invocations of death, demonry, and vacuous consumption. Now, of course, be it Samhain or today's Halloween, Christians are, of course, right to regard with caution any open celebration or association with the occult or any extra-biblical supernatural elements. Yet, that shouldn't necessitate a complete dismissal of the reality found within the dark and scary unknown of life. A sanitized story told with no conflict, heartache, or dismay might pass Sunday school muster in its innocuous, inoffensive, excessive appropriateness. But even if no one says it out loud, the listeners know they're being robbed of any honest reflection on the human Imago Dei experience. It's why overly safe Christian films can fall so flat. The hallmarkification of the Christian life is less of an empathetic mirror, rich in cathartic edification, and more of a purity spiraling fairy tale where, yes, God is real in the story, but the people sure aren't. And so it is with those believers who shun Halloween, but choose to celebrate alternative events like harvest festivals or trunk or treats, which avoid Halloween's darker themes. It's not telling a story with a happy ending, it's just telling context-free happy, which, again, is done because both the Protestant and overly material world have already discarded the spiritual and more enchanted parts of Allhallowtide. But even if you see the value in emphasizing the original Christian elements, especially in All Saints and All Souls days on November 1st and 2nd, I would still ask you not to shy away from the dark and scary day that precedes them. In an excellent video by Oliver Murrary, linked in the description below, he and a friend both advocate for Christians to reclaim Halloween as an opportunity to engage with themes of death and the supernatural in a meaningful way rather than avoiding it entirely. They also discuss our culture's excessive focus on death, stating that without the balance provided by Christian traditions, such as All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, Halloween has spiraled into a consumerist, worshipful embrace of death, which is a kind of celebration of black-pilled nihilism. Yet much like in a Requiem Mass, the Dies Irae, Latin for Day of Wrath, meaning Day of Judgment, with its haunting melodies so potent it still appears in popular culture, from marching band scores of classical works by Liszt and Berlioz, up to John Williams' score for Star Wars. We see the death and terror comes first. Then comes the lux aeterna, the eternal light. Then the in paradisium. Just as the dark precedes the dawn, so the grave precedes the coming resurrection. As John Donne's Holy Sonnet number 10 puts into perspective, borrowing from 1 Corinthians 15, he writes, "Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful. For thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death. Nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow. And soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and souls delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell. And poppier charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. Why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die." Likewise, in acknowledgement of death, the memento mori, so beloved by modern-day Stoics, is a crucial part of the story. But death is not the end of the story. Just as the fall of leaves and the barren branches of a cold and dark winter are not the end of the tree. There is a rebirth, a new life, a resurrection. We see the power of symbols in nature all around us, and we see them in our culture and shared mythologies. Deeper truths about the human experience and spiritual reality than the simple, the sterile, the overly literal. So, is Halloween a Christian holiday in origin? No, of course not. But does that mean it has nothing to offer in symbolic richness and textured history? Does that mean we cannot look to its traditions and find value in their enchanting power? tapping into something metaphysical that is both real and yet intangible. Halloween traditions such as using pumpkins and trick-or-treating symbolize engagement with fear and darkness. Trick-or-treating can be seen as a reenactment of confronting and managing evil forces, done in a playful manner. By approaching the unknown bravely and with great boldness, reflecting the balance between fear, protection, and faith. The jack-o'-lantern originates from an Irish myth about a man named Stingy Jack, who tricked the devil, yet couldn't get into heaven and so was cursed to wander the earth with only a carved turnip lantern. The Irish carved faces into turnips or potatoes to scare away Jack's wandering spirit. When immigrants came to America, they found pumpkins, which were larger and easier to carve, thus starting the tradition of the jack-o'-lantern. Bobbing for apples has its roots in the Roman festival honoring Pomona, the goddess of fruit and trees. When the Romans conquered Celtic lands, their customs blended with those of the local inhabitants. In Celtic mythology, the apple is often associated with the other world, a mystical realm inhabited by spirits. The act of bobbing for apples, therefore, may have symbolized the pursuit of knowledge or good fortune, as the apple can represent the rewards of the harvest. In later centuries, bobbing for apples became a game associated with a form of divination. Players in the game believed that the way they caught an apple could predict their future, particularly in matters of love. Over time, bobbing for apples became a common party game during Halloween. And finally, the storytelling was an integral part of the Samhain tradition, as the Celts believed Samhain was a time to honor and remember those who passed away. So, sharing stories and memories of those who had gone on before them kept their memory alive and reinforced the connection between the living and the dead. As for ghost stories, they served many purposes. One was a cautionary tale, which would warn against certain behaviors or actions. By recounting stories of spirits or supernatural occurrences, you could convey moral lessons and cultural values, reinforcing those desired customs within the community. Also, the darker nights of fall, along with the harvest season's natural end, both lent themselves to eerie storytelling. This also helped brace the community for the challenging times ahead. Wintertime has long been associated with hardship and death, so ghost stories help people confront their fears about mortality and the unknown, making the onset of winter less daunting. And likewise, we see this today. It's not for nothing that people of all ages are drawn to ghost stories, drawn to scary movies and tales in the dark. The catharsis from confronting what scares you allows you to conquer your fear in a way that's manageable. Cognitive behavioral therapy attests to this. The treasure lies beneath the dragon, as they say. Much of life is unknown and scary and unpredictable and vast, and no one escapes alive, not until the rapture. For everyone else, it's memento mori. Remember that you and everyone you know shall one day die. But like so much in life, the way out of fear and death is through the Lord's death, through that of your old self, and one day your old flesh. The night closes in, even the greenest of leaves turn to dust. But after the darkness of a day's eve comes the brightness of all saints, all souls, like candles relit. So tell the whole tale and embrace the dies irae, for after it comes the eternal light of paradise.